thank you all for having me here on the other side of the planet. It's pretty much right, through the middle. And we came here a couple of days ago with our newborn. So he is 3 months old and has traveled by now, it's the 20,000 miles that reaches us here. I have a special connection to New Zealand, although I've only been here once before. One of my partners and co-founders, who also was running our Beijing office for 10 years, he has emigrated to New Zealand, left our company and has started his own company, and he now lives and has built in Kare Kare, where I have cured my jet lag and experienced also a little bit the New Zealand black of his architecture, famous in Europe. With your light, you can build in dark colors. You would never do that where I come from on the Baltic Sea. You're really happy to catch every ray of sun that you can get. So I am actually also living on the coast all my life, firstly on the Baltics, in that state of Germany where the Anglo-Saxons actually in the early Middle Ages emigrated to Britain, and which eventually then also made their way here. Then I lived in Barcelona on the Mediterranean and also on the Pacific Rim in Christopher's hometown for 10 years in Los Angeles until now I'm residing, as we say back home, on the dry. I'm living in Berlin since 10 years in the Lake District, still sailing, but nothing comparable to, of course, the beautiful New Zealand. This is our show-off map. We are a 150 people firm with 3 locations, building, on the darker dots, building around the world with a little bit of specialty, as you will see a little later in the presentation, that we are having a stronger focus on Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, which is an interesting place to help, but also an interesting place to create new architectural narratives. But firstly, a little bit what we are about, curiosity. Kurt Tucholsky, famous writer in Germany before the Nazis came, said, detours increase the knowledge of a place. That is very true for our office. Curiosity is not an instinct. It is something that you culturally learn, and we try to really provoke that in our office. The German architecture fee structure is defined by law. You cannot really freely negotiate. So what we normally do in the first phases, conceptual and schematic design, we waste all the buffer within the fee budget because we take those detours. We try to do disruptive thinking already since 20 years before it was kind of named that way. So we are searching also for these sort of hybrid cultural clashes to really understand graftings, transplantations, cultures of innovations. Dave Hickey, that I'm sure Christopher knows, a famous art critic in the United States. He was my thesis advisor at SciArc, and he coined that phrase that is still guiding us today. Taste is just the lack of appetite. We are not looking at a signature style. We're looking at hunger, at really at every project's new beginning. We really want to get that new taste into our mouth. This is a good picture. It's a good friend of ours. As a good symbol, he invented, through an art project, a sport that is by now on Eurosports with TV rights sold. It's called chess boxing. You play a round of chess, you box around, you play a round of chess, you box around. And this is exactly how it started 10 years ago as a joke, as an artistic sort of joke, but by now has become a real new economic sort of sport dynamic, an interesting set of hybrid rules, because you can't play good chess after your 3rd round of boxing. You really need to learn your play very well. Adrenaline sort of totally kicks in and distorts your sense of behavioral patterns that you have learned for chess. So we are looking for these stories. We're looking for these assumed opposites that are fused into something third, something new, with chess boxing, the smartest and the strongest man on this planet. Also, of course, Germans are very proud of our 2nd astronaut in space. So he just came back from space station, and he really strengthened what we call, since the 60s, the so-called overview effect. The overview effect happened when the Russians and the Americans brought back the first picture of Earth from the outside. And so creating that sense that we are, passenger on a big planet in space, and we need to take care of it. So we use this overview effect, and our new astronaut has really created a new discussion, again, within the German society of caretaking. A little bit what we heard today in the beginning when we were welcomed by the local people. Well, I'm in love with chess boxing. Let's go forward, though. Because we were founded in LA, then moved to Berlin, then have built an office in Beijing and built around the world, we learned that our academic thinking, our language, our semantics do not work for all our clients the same way. So we needed to find a way to translate academical discourse into narrations that a Mongolian hotel developer can understand, as well as my colleagues at CIARC, etc. So we really found also what I also learned this morning about the grandmothers in Maori culture, that storytelling, is the social currency in which we also do translate most of our architectural projects. And while we teach, we take our students also outside the school environment. I'm a strong believer that the most beautiful forms and spaces can be taught by nature. I'm a big fan, besides the sailing, also of mountaineering, and these are my students in the classroom where we normally go, and we just finished a project with Reinhold Messner for sort of mountain alpine rescue shelters. But I think, from curiosity, cultural hybrids, narrations, to the learning from nature is really describing well where we come from. And of course that means, and that's also how we select our staff, and that's hopefully what our staff also takes away from us. It was easy in school to be provocative. It was easy to sort of challenge the status quo, but to do this as a design firm that has to make a living for 150 staff every day is a consensus that needs to be built within our office every day. But so far, we are happy to not join the Navy, as Steve Jobs says, but to have an office that is really proud to be rather a pirate dragon boat going to Britain and then to New Zealand 100 years later. Dave mentioned it quickly. Over the years, we started as a standard architecture firm. We eventually started to consult government, politicians, industry leaders, started an agency of branding, because I think the storytelling of architecture doesn't end with the finish of the building, but it also starts before you actually start to draw. Like every Renaissance man or every Frank Lloyd Wright fan, you want to design everything, so we try to do product design. And from all of this, and I will end my lecture with that, a lot of socially important projects happened that eventually became companies by themselves. But going quickly into what scales we do work in, we like to do urban planning. This is my favorite urban planning project. I'm working on it since 9 years. It's in the Bahamas, in an uninhabited island, where we are since then doing a biodiversity studies to get the permit to actually inhabit it well. So it's a very large-scale, long-term, slow process. We do standard ground-up building. We do buildings that never get built. I'm a big, as I said, mountaineering. This is a big ski jump in northern China. I'm still hoping for that one. Most other Chinese projects have that special lifespan of, paper is very patient. I'm not. Interiors, as our colleagues that were happening before, as a lecturer, we are doing a lot of our acquisition through competitions. I was talking about the longboat. This is an extension of one of the famous museums in Norway. Unfortunately, we didn't win that one, but rarely have a chance to show how we made the underground extension of our cultures. But we do work in these different environments, and sometimes I'm happy to be able to leave the urban market, which is the bigger market in Europe, an ice stadium, urban wood, interiors, going down on scale, doing product development for our clients, a big lighting sculpture that just got finished, and furniture baking down to the last nail is something that we'd really like to go and design. And here, coming back, that even furniture talks about the meeting of land and water, Baltic Sea to the Pacific Rim. Home story. Berlin is a very special place. I'm sure some in the audience have visited us. If you look at the central map of Germany, of Berlin, you can see the overlay of blue, which is the war destruction. If you kind of subtract that, that is really what was left over in 1945 from the city substance. Berlin had 5 million inhabitants in 1939. We're up to 3.6 million right now. So we're still reconstructing 70 years after, after that sort of really shameful and never to be forgotten history. And then secondly, one has to not forget that we lived under 2 dictatorships, and the second dictatorship created the largest piece of property in the central, metropolitan area ever existing in Germany. The wall was not a line. The wall was a huge piece of land that was going through exactly, as you can see, the city's heart. And that was the topic of our curation last year at the Venice Biennial, because the wall has now been gone for 28 years, and the wall was only standing for 28 years. It is something that we cannot almost imagine that 28 years later, the wall's still there. It's in the heads. You can still see it in the property maps of our city. You can still see it in the built debate of styles, ownership, public or private accessibility of that land. And so it was time to really revisit for one more moment that really only happy moment in the 20th century, I'd say, that we Germans created, 1989, and really also look at that mirror effect of how easy it is to destroy something and how complicated it is to heal. And we were, as we said, my German partners in our company were 3 men. We were in our 20s when the wall was falling, and we decided we need a reunified team. So we needed a woman, we needed somebody from East Germany, and we needed somebody from a different generation. So we decided to really create a pact with Marianne Bürtler. She is a federal minister of the ministry who is controlling the secret police data files, and she and us co-curated this pavilion, just going quickly because it is really that biggest property and some sort of a lens through to which look at Berlin. This is the German pavilion. We wanted to create in that moment of entrance with an anamorphotic optical trick, that sensation of closeness, and then when you move, when you change your standpoint going through that door, the wall suddenly falls apart. You go through it, and then on the other side, there is, for every year, there's one project exhibiting the different phases, almost psychological, therapeutical phases of how that city was unbuilding that wall. And I have a little movie that I hope will play to just prove that it actually did work a little bit with some suspended disbelief. And we just took that exhibition down shortly before Christmas, but it gives you a little bit of that sensation of intimidation, kinetic experience, defragmentation of the wall, and hopefully never to be coming back again. One of the ironies is that the German pavilion in Venice was built by the Nazis, and so every curator is kind of having nightmare dreams how to deal with that sort of building, with that sort of context. We decided to not deal with it, just to build in there. And this is our mayor. Of course, everywhere on the planet, architecture is a very political discipline. You need to form alliances. I was really happy when 2 years ago, I think it was, that Christopher changed from critiquing our profession to now building it on the political side. And actually, particularly Berlin and LA are sister cities, and the mayors are, particularly also since Trump came into office, the international coalition of metropolitan mayors is really, I think, what also drives potential change, potential innovation into a future of hope. Of course, we are rebuilding the Prussian castle in concrete and gluing some sort of Baroque facade over it again. And of course, that forms a lot of debate, but also a lot of frustration for the younger generation. And then there is this unscripted city, because as you could see, all these void of the subtracted building mass through the wars created a vast reserve of emptiness that was filled by squatters, by people who were using it temporarily, who were not having to pay for it. And since just a couple of years ago, Berlin therefore was a mecca for young artists, the creative class, to migrate to our city, because you could, as an artist, get extremely cheap studio space. Living was not a problem. I have friends of us had, like, for $100 you would rent a place with 70 square meters, no problem, center city. This now is all changing, because the phenomenon of Zwischennutzung, the in-between usage, is now changing, and that sort of ugliness is also vanishing quickly. So how do we build in Berlin? We have to deal a lot with fill-ins. Our building code has, as typical German sort of behavior, prescribes not only how to do, mass, FAR, all these kind of things, but what color, how large the windows should be. So sometimes you kind of wonder why do I have to be an architect? We take a graphic standard plus building code, and architecture comes out of it. But there, you go into some play, some Czech cubism, or how to do stucco decorations from the 19th century into a 21st century place, how to mimic the plaster facade with some sort of steel materiality. But it is a very, very tamed discussion that you sometimes have to orientate yourself in. But, of course, we need to densify and create more space. So at the moment, all these sort of 100-year-old urbanistic sort of patterns are filled with the same building volumes, but internally we make them smaller and subdivide them to much smaller and smaller units because of the unaffordability of rental prices. So these places have apartments roughly the size 40 square meters, 35 square meters. This will be for a demographic situation in Germany. We're an aging society where, lesser and less people will have to pay more and more taxes for the future pension demanders. So what we do is how to create a city or an apartment densification that limits and reduces your private space and therefore the quality of life. And we do that we say, we give, in our apartment designs, we normally create huge areas or huge areas of small subdivided residential apartments, and then we create rentable living rooms. So that if your family comes over for dinner, you rent the big living room downstairs that you do not own, but you can share as a sharing economy within the building. So the business model of saving for your college tuition, classical real estate sort of Excel sheet cases, plus the possibility to hybridize with rental product is what I think is a good solution at the moment to within the existing envelope of urban density. If we do urban, if we have this behavior and this obedience, this is the first street art museum. We could not take, of course, anything out of the city. We needed to go with the city substance. So this is a classic 1819 corner block, emptied out, and on the interior, we basically now fill in new program into a nostalgic sort of city pattern that we're not allowed to change. Of course, when we talk about how to then play within these envelopes, there are more miniature moments of architectural innovation. So we talk about how we do bricklaying with a parametric sort of approach. We are shifting vertical logics of the construction side, the construction of the buildings in the 19th century to horizontals. And we're discussing, of course, also a lot about the use of public versus private opportunities. The good thing about Berlin is that we do have waterfront, we do have prime real estate locations that haven't been used since 1945 and are still up to grabs. And there's, of course, a lot of discussion how to deal and how to reserve certain public interest while we do this. So one of our projects here is that we say, instead of building blocks along the waterfront, we open these blocks and allow everybody along the promenade to penetrate deeply and use the privately owned property and therefore get a certain sense. As I said, 22-meter horizon. There is now a discussion for a high-rise plan in the making. As we all like rule sets very much back home, of course, the high-rises also now all have to have the same height also. So the American individualism or the discourse of pluralistic architectural expression, or that a city can basically also be a field of experiments of multiple identities of architecture, sort of possibilities, that is still something that we in Berlin have to learn. But we do have these pioneering possibilities in the emptiness that is still not filled. So a lot of temporary buildings are going on, buildings in the Kunsthal of ours. And most of these buildings are happening along the line of the former wall, the biggest property that was not given back to its former owners in most cases. And one of the interesting things here, I want to show one of these a little deeper. We even have a New Zealand black building. This is a craft brewery in town. But you have suddenly new owners, new co-ops who claim these properties that nobody had claimed after the war or after the wall came down, and do something new to it. This is one of our projects for refugee housing. But what I wanted to go into is really focus quickly on one of the sites that we have been under development right now. For 20 years, this was the most famous club of Germany, the Bar 25. These are the owners. They probably, for 20 years, took all the drugs you can imagine and eventually had kids and decided something really seriously had to happen. And they came to us as architects and said, well, we just bought the piece of property that we squatted for 20 years, and now we want to really do something that nobody has done before. Here it is, riverfront. And they wanted to break every code. So they said, we want to build the first German high-rises in wood. We want to build denser. We want to build as dense as Hong Kong, something that is not allowed. We have a rule of social distance that is mandatory, typical German. We are a culture of settlers who needed to have a certain distance between farmhouses. Villages came only into our culture in the later Middle Ages. And so they said, well, we talk to the politicians and we say social distance is not the code, social closeness is our desire. And so you can see a lot of these things happening. We are lucky because we are in the district of Kreuzberg in Berlin, and Kreuzberg is the only district that sends a direct member to parliament from the Green Party. So we have a politically favorable environment. And so we are at the moment really developing 11 stories urban wood construction with a density and with the measurement of dreams built into it that is beyond realization. We have koi carps in the basement. Their poo goes up to the roof in the greenhouses that fertilizes the food. The restaurants cook it. The leftovers of the cooking is fed to the koi carps. And so there's a lot of cyclic economies and dreams built into this. We learned the hard way that you cannot convince your client that not everything is possible, so we actually by now playing it out a little bit in time. You see the density, we have a trick to the code. We put a roof over it, and if you don't heat it, you actually can probably get the density achieved, but this is also something that we're still trying to wait for. We had a little problem that the senator or the city councilman who was putting the political alliance together to approve this just died unexpectedly. And so we're starting, like in a democracy, you start from scratch. You see a little bit of wood construction, and you can see how we design it in the front, and then you can see what our client still thinks he can design in the back. When the architect is left, he doesn't understand that wooden facades for high-rises require external sprinklers in Germany and so forth. So again, we said, we will wait and see. We'll see if that happens. will give you a good skeleton of architectural possibilities, and then you can do it later. This is a larger urban settlement that we have just finished, and the most important thing on this picture is the car, because this is a rental product, and we rent it with a car. This is an electric car. These are plus energy houses. And since Angela Merkel, I have to say, is now Chancellor, unfortunately, the feed-in tariffs of our society are not stable anymore. They are negotiated every day in a market, so you do not actually know if your solar panel is worth the same amount of money tomorrow than it was today. And so one of the things that we as architects a lot of times forgot is to really also think about the Excel sheet, of the architecture before it's actually built. And we said, well, if we want to do public plus energy housing, we need to give them another return of invest than the feed-in tariffs for surplus electricity. And we said, well, we could give them mobility. And we save on the battery for the house. We don't have to have storage built into the house. The storage is the car. It's half the price of the car already. And we almost get 11,000 Berlin kilometers out of our house per year if we really don't use the energy that we surplus. So these houses are at the moment into experimentation. Of course, they're also ecologically sound. Sustainability has a big health debate attached to it right now in our country. Not only conservation of resources and energy, but health becomes the big sustainable driver also. So we have carpets who collect dust. We have, a balance between wood construction and massive construction to have core storages, et cetera, et cetera. Mobility in Europe, in Germany particularly now, has a big discussion about do we change the combustion engine to electric vehicles from Volkswagen, Audi, BMW, Mercedes. There is a saying that 20% of the German BPI are produced through the value creation chains of car companies. So this is a big thing. And at the moment, and I was smiling this morning when Christopher talked about the gas station in Los Angeles. At the moment, the charging stations, the network of charging stations are a real big issue. And they are not driven by car companies, but by the electricity providers. And there's a big talk about how this does work as a business case, because gas stations do not only sell energy, they do sell fast-turning consumer goods. If you now start to charge a car, it takes 20 minutes. What do you do with these 20 minutes? So there's a lot of talk about how E.ON is one of the big German electricity providers, how the idea of a startup hope can happen. How does ecological soundness work? How to create modular architecture that can be rolled out all over Europe? And how do you do this, of course, also in an environment that at the moment looks like this, frosty and cold? And lastly, because we were coming from LA, no driver, but even now there is, of course, an architecture within the digital realm. So we do start to work with Uber here. Here's one of the big map and GPS providers for autonomous driving. We try to start visualizing the invisible architecture of the digital realm. This is a model of San Francisco, because of course the future of individual driving will be car sharing. We will come into a society where you do not own your car. You will have to share the car. Only then can we have growing numbers of users and the same amount of street surface in a way start to work out. And the intelligence of that sharing architecture is something that we did communicate or are developing certain physical and digital interface models for the consumer base to understand what is coming towards us. And you can see a little bit how this works. There is some nice Berlin techno music supposed to play with it, but we don't have it right now. I have to say that this is the project in our office where I'm really kind of disconnected from what we are really doing. I'm the guy with the greasy finger on the screen. asking my staff to say, can we do and change this? And because these algorithmic programming is really now beyond my generational sort of education. So it's also an interesting experience to be an architect in a time where I learned hand drawing and the ink pen that always plugged. That was sort of still the razor where you scratch the papers clean. And then the first Macintosh 2 AutoCAD versions came on board. And I tried to keep up, and I had a professorship for BIM education, but now, with the new software speed of evolution, I'm basically giving up. And become really already early in life that grandfather who just says, can we do this, can we do that? And lastly, last chapter, as I said, life's been good to us. I went to Los Angeles in 1989 with a German scholarship, and I called it the Extended Childhood Program. That was at the time when Germany rebuilt the Prussian castle, our education system in the end 90s, which was free, but didn't have any money to buy computers, so digital architecture was not taught. So I went to Los Angeles and stayed there, started our company in Los Angeles, and we really, really had some classic American dream surprises coming true for us, and started in a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 partners living, rolled the futon away in the morning, folded down the table, and were lucky to make it. And that luck was something that we kind of infused in us to say, we want to be able to give back. We all come from very small bourgeois, working class backgrounds, and so we don't take things for granted. And therefore, when 12 years ago by now, Hurricane Katrina happened in New Orleans, one of the biggest natural catastrophes at the time worldwide, we decided that we do want to take our possibilities as architects, scale them, with sweat equity to something useful, and give back, and decided to help rebuild the lower Ninth Ward, one of the poorest areas in New Orleans. We enlisted a good friend of ours who was one of our first clients, Brad Pitt, part of that sort of story to get lucky early on in life. You can't have a recipe for that. But he donated $2 million, and we said, we're not going to build any house for it. We want to make an art project with $2 million. Built the so-called Pink Project City, very photogenic, made us $7 million in donations in 6 weeks. We're gambling, so to speak, on that sort of first donor, and made a return on this. Enlisted a bunch of the people we know from Los Angeles, from the United States, and from worldwide. Everybody got 10 grand to do a house design up to design development, and had to sign off that we can repeat it forever. And while we were doing something else for Brett and Angelina at the time, a big hospital in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, we came across other cases where change through architecture should happen, can happen. Africa is basically, everybody in Africa has a cell phone. The cell phone is basically, if you as a man want to court a bride, you give her a cell phone, has 2 advantages. You have a social sort of social status or a social token of your wealth that you give away, and you can call her afterwards. And so cell phones are quite widespread in sub-Saharan Africa, but there's no electricity. So we decided, and this is quite obvious, when we were building the hospital, you were just standing around, and what people were doing is they were waving down cars on the street, open the hood, put with 2 cables a cell phone on the car battery, and those cell phones don't last much. So we decided, wow, that's our business case. We were stupid architects. We thought, well, we're going to do like many, many millions of chargings, and this will be our case, because, if you look at the map, light does not mean that's where people live. Light does only mean that's where people live who can afford light. But we have 1.5 billion people in the dark areas who are not having access to this electricity. And so 10 years ago, quite naively, we started the solar kiosk after Make It Right, after some hospitals in sub-Saharan Africa, and we decided, let's build an architecturally enhanced charging station that does everything that also our gas stations do. We sell energy, we sell fast-turning consumer goods, we sell we can cool the medicines, we can clean water, and we can basically bring light into Africa. Because if you have ever traveled Africa, this is what it looks like at night. You have a lot of dense settlements, but you have no light at night. And this is our solar kiosk, shining in the dark. By now, we have 200-something units deployed in 6 countries, and they have become business centers. We run them. We have 2,000 people by now employed in the company. These are mostly women, because women don't waste the money. They actually are trustworthy. They don't drink, or they don't drink beyond a certain useless pattern. And they help us really to create what we call the clean energy ladder, because you have really you have energy consumption in this area, but you have it with generators, with kerosene lamps, with really, really bad energy carriers. And slowly but surely in sub-Saharan Africa, people realize that we have 5.2 hours of solar installation per day. So, there's free energy coming from our universe onto our planet, and most of it lands in exactly that spot. We can harvest it. We can scale it up from a solar kiosk, from one solar lantern to small pico systems, to solar home systems and mini grids. And mini grids is what we are doing right now. So we are going beyond that individual unit that you see here and start to expand out, bring business in. We're becoming the sort of internet cafe where you order, online from the capital, the seeds for your field. We are the delivery station, and now are acting in those countries. And if we say 2,000 people, we're urban developers with a small kiosk. We are really making people stay in their villages. We educate builders. We have a manufacturing process now in 3 countries because you don't want to import only first world technology to this. We employ a lot of people, and we do education. Education in these countries is not a frontal educational academic networks. We create comic cartoons, the Solar King versus the Coal Queen, or the Coal Queen versus Solar King. And so good design is therefore not a first world privilege, and we were able to now have corporate investors investing in solar kiosks and are on that edge where, starting from New Orleans to Africa, this will now become a self-sufficient company that now is starting actually also to give back. This is our first donation to the world from the solar kiosk evolution to Satari. Satari is the fastest growing city on the planet. It's close to the border of Syria in Jordania, a refugee camp with over 1 million refugees since the Syrian conflict started. And our solar kiosk company has by now deployed quite a few clinics. We are also in Bangladesh in the Rohingya refugee camps right now. So this makes us proud that we can by now sort of create that sort of wheel that turns itself. And this is what our, the essence of architecture, that little house that glows in the dark, that creates shelter and creates living and business for people in a world where walls, separation, and disenfranchisement is still happening. And I'm circling back to the Venice Biennale. These are the walls that are still existing. The German wall has disappeared 28 years ago. We have many, many people that are still living in the shadow of the walls. And we have politicians who think that walls are great ideas. So part of our exhibition in Venice was also to capture these voices. Maria Seifert, my wife, was traveling the world for 1 year with our baby in her belly already to create that video installation, asking all these inhabitants on all sides of these new, still existing walls, what is the future of walls? And we created a scholarship. It has just been decided who will be the recipient this day, but I would invite everybody for next year, where we have we give out 2 scholarships for people who are interested in joining our passion and joining our interest to take down our walls of the world, because our office believes in it. Our company thinks that beyond building, you can do change in the world, And as Germans, we say, we're done with walls. Wa ka we tai, thank you and danke sehr.
So that was fantastic. Thank you for such a great talk and covering so much territory. And I'm keenly aware that the three of us are the only folks keeping all of them from the cocktail hour. So we will be efficient in our questions. But you really touched on so many themes. And I do want to get a little bit to Los Angeles and Berlin. But a couple questions about the solar kiosk that you touched on at the end. I'm just curious about the political and logistical practicalities. What kinds of clients, NGOs, local governments, local groups are you working with? What does it mean to actually figure out where those should go and then figure out how to actually get them there, putting aside all of the kind of architectural and technical questions that you raised, which are so fascinating?
Yeah, actually I thought between afternoon tea and cocktail is actually a really good sort of spot. You know, so we'll keep it short. Cocktails will come in a sec. Yeah, solar kiosk is not a for sale business. We thought that part of that social responsibility is that we need to control margins and the spirit of the company, and therefore we are more a car rental or let's say a real estate rental company. We own all of those. That means we need a lot of cash because we need to basically build these 200 kiosks and own them and deploy them, and we control the value creation chain and take care that nobody else can distort the original idea. So NGOs get them for free when they go into good work in these refugee camps, and everybody else gets, depending on country, a very low rent with a long-term amortization. If there's a bad harvest in the village, we lower the rent. If there's a good harvest in the village next to, they kind of compensate. It is a tricky thing. We have lost a bunch of kiosks also in the bush that never returned. You know, there are great stories about Africa. And my favorite story is when we had somebody in Ethiopia didn't pay rent for half a year. So we went there and said, hey, you signed a contract. And he said, well, I have 20 spares. I was like, spares? What do you mean? And he went, well, you know, where are you people? Where did you bring your spears? And I said, well, no, I didn't. I thought we had a contract. And so there are lots of things in there. So we have calculated 20 to 30% loss in the overall spectrum.
And what specifically did you learn from Make It Right in the New Orleans experience that you've applied to the activism work that you're doing now? I went to New Orleans right after Katrina also. The editor of that moment at the LA Times is now the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, Dean Baquet, and he comes from a New Orleans family, and he understood right away that that story would not just be a disaster story, it would also be an architecture story and a food story, of course, a culture story. So I slept on the floor of the sports bar in the only hotel in New Orleans that was operating after the storm. So I remember following that whole process quite closely. It's a very difficult political situation in which to operate, and I'm just curious what you took from that experience that you've now applied to the other activism projects that you're engaged in.
What I took from it is that you are in for the long haul. And New Orleans was based on that effect of everybody wanted to help. And maybe, as you have read in the papers also, I've been on the board since 3 years. I'm not on the board of Make It Right anymore, and it's you know, all that volunteer enthusiasm has sort of died out, and so the momentum is fading away. But now certain houses have leaks, other have mold, and so you really, if you are a steward of that idea, you need to be in there forever. And that's why with Solar Kiosk we said, let's build it as a not for-profit but for-purpose company that eventually has built-in goals and cyclic logic that is not depending on grants, NGO money, etc. So, and I'd say we are a year away from it at Solar Kiosk, and that would be the biggest learning, that if you don't stay for it with 20 years, these things will fall apart again.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was really interested in the pro bono stuff as well. I think that's wonderful, and it's probably a lesson maybe for all of us, in that we could be taking that into our practices. Say, what have you done that you didn't get paid for in any one year? It's very cool. My question actually is 150 staff, three different countries, and number one son, 3 months old. I just want to know, do you get any sleep?
Well, he needs feeding every 2 hours, and I'm at the biological advantage at the moment still that I'm allowed to sleep through it. But yeah, no, I'm 50 now. We just had a couple of new partners bubbling up from staff in the office that we gave some shares, and so my hope is that I do a little bit like what Gregor did with moving to Kare Kare. Maybe in a few years that there will be a 10-year transition of the next generation coming. I do teach also like Christopher, and that's a lot of fun. So I'm 20 years of sweat and tears. Now also, I do a lot of work on the political level, and so that sort of combination of different roles, different shoes you can walk in is great. But as we all know, as architects, that's not a 9-to-5 profession. So eventually, I'm depending on others taking the relay, or how do you say that?
I was curious to dig into this LA, Berlin, these sort of polar opposites in terms of how we understand cities and planning. On the one hand, the kind of laissez-faire, as you mentioned, individualism of Los Angeles. On the other, Berlin is a highly prescriptive environment for architects. On the other hand, I was struck by some of the connections that you were teasing out between the two cities. I was really struck by this notion of Germans coming from a tradition of space and that kind of almost a single-family model like we're trying to break away from in Los Angeles. Also, car companies and car culture as being such big forces in the cities. Now, having lived and worked in both places, what's your sense of that relationship, and do you see yourself coming back to the west coast of the U.S. later on?
Yeah, there's a strong mythology about Los Angeles within German culture, because a lot of the German intellectuals were fleeing the Nazis. You know, Bertolt Brecht or Fritz Lang, film people, literature people, Feuchtwanger, etc. So a lot of people went to LA, and Thomas Mann, and brought back, of course, that promise that LA was holding at the time. And what was drawing me was really the freedom of architecture discourse that was the LA 90s, that was so contradictory to what was happening in our country. When the wall came down, everybody that graduated opened an office. That was like the best time ever. And I graduated in 1995 when that boom was dying out. And and then the computer came, and so we were really participating in something that in LA, in something that was lost in Berlin. When we came back and opened an office in Berlin, it was kind of the one-eyed between the blind. We were immediately successful with all these sort of gifts that the LA dynamic was giving us. If you entered the podium discussion in LA, it took immediately off with some positive thinking, with some enthusiastic, with some competition of who is overpowering with great ideas and critical thinking the other. And in Germany, it was a debate of greediness and not sharing and not being generous. That hopefully is changing right now. And the internationality that is now moving into Berlin, a lot of startup culture from California is finding a hub within the Berlin environment. That also has now hopefully repercussions eventually into the artistic and architecture community. Berlin was always famous for modern and classical music, the young German art scene, good designers, etc. In architecture, we were, just not interesting. Try to find an architecture book from Hans Koloff in an LA bookstore. That's not so possible.
And as a follow-up to that, I'm curious to know more about the debate over height limits, for example. That's another area of commonality, actually, because one of the things I learned after taking my new job in the mayor's office is that we have a de facto height limit in Los Angeles in the form of a 13-to-1 FAR cap, which is actually written into the city charter. So if we wanted to have pockets of greater height, we'd actually have to take that question to the voters, which I think is a fascinating prospect to think about. How has it been playing out in Berlin? Where would those new pockets of height go in the city, and how has that been playing out politically?
Yeah, height is only one of the strategies for densification. If you maybe remember those maps before and after the war, you could see that it was a much denser city before the war already. So I think that was proven that we could live much denser than today. The height corridors are along the rivers at the moment. So they, of course, follow the classical value of real estate demand. So I think that's okay. Germans are used to live in apartment densities. They are not in urban environments, not anymore looking for the sort of pastoral crabgrass frontier dream.
Right.
But we need to, for Berlin, we need to discuss if we can go even denser, I think. And lighting is an issue, acoustic, social closeness is an issue, but we were 5 million people on the same area in 1939. I think we could really we could reopen these old zoning laws to a certain extent. We don't only need to create new ones with high-rise, but we're growing so fast. Berlin was promised when the wall came down that we will be in the center of Europe, the city that is connecting Eastern Europe and Western Europe. And so huge amount of growth were predicted, and we didn't grow for 20 years. 100,000 people would move to Berlin a year, and 100,000 people would move away from Berlin every year because there's no economical base. We lost all the industrial workforce base because of the blockade of the Soviets, etc. And only now we have 50,000 to 60,000 inhabitants moving in a year. That's nothing for your city, but interesting enough, our public transportation system, the metro, all these things are still laid out and worked for 5 million people because it's that old. So we have actually advantages that no other city has.
So the capacity is there for
the capacity is there.
More population.
So let's move it. I'm more, I'm not a neoliberal architect, but I think for Germany, we could be a little bit more trustworthy on the talent of our profession, on allowing pluralistic discussion through building versus only on panels. And if a building is really ugly, it's going to go away after 50 years. You know, that's happening too. You know, why not allowing it to go?
Believe it or not,
we do ours about 10. Yeah, we only make ours last 10
right,
sometimes.
Yeah, even better.
I was just going to say quickly, believe it or not, Los Angeles City was zoned for a 10 million population, actually, in the middle decades of the 20th century. And then we had successive waves of downzoning that brought it down closer to about 4 million where it is now. And now we have to bring it back up. So there was a period that we were looking at a similar kind of density.
Okay, maybe we wrap it up now, because I think
Cocktails?
people are probably ready for cocktails. Thanks again, Wolfram.
Thank you,
Very
Dave.
good.